home would be 5 days if they are exposed outside of school. That's what we are asking for changes to our guidance. Our second authorization we are asking, I don't have a slide for this, but I did want to talk about this, was Senate Bill 25 with remote days. So we first off have to know non-traditional instruction days. We have 10 of those that have been given to us by the General Assembly for the 2021-2022 school year. That is the traditional non-NTI days that we are in right now, that we have been used to for the past few years, where we can send the entire district into NTI. We didn't use any of those in the first semester. We used 4 last week. We will be using 4 this week. That will be 8. That will give us 2 remaining NTI days for the remainder of the year. As I said last week, once we reach 10, there is no such thing as NTI anymore for this academic year. So if we are not having school, our only 2 options at that point would be to cancel school, but if we don't have enough employees, would be to cancel school and add those hours somewhere else, most likely at the end of the year. And our second option, with your approval, would be remote days that were authorized and signed in by the governor on Friday. The difference between NTI and remote days is essentially we cannot have the entire district, all students cannot be in remote days. So for us to use remote days, some students would have to be in-person school, and they are used more to identify. We could use them for individual schools. We could use them for certain levels. Like we could say high school might be remote days, elementary and middle might be in person. But we would have to have some go to school. That is the major component that is different in remote days. We cannot send the entire district NTI. With your approval, we would have 10 of those. It is challenging as how to use those, but obviously we think it's an increased flexibility that we would need. So we would ask tonight for you all to grant authorization for us to also have those, for me to issue those remote learning days when necessary. So once again, our recommended motion is that the Board of Education approve the revised COVID-19 school operations plan and authorize the superintendent to temporarily assign students to remote instruction. That concludes our presentation, Chair Porter.
Thank you, Dr. Pollio. I will now call on board members for their thoughts and comments. We will use the timer for 5 minutes. If you ask a question that takes up the whole 5 minutes, then we will give you another 5 minutes and then come back to you if you have additional questions. So with your approval, Board Member McIntosh, I'd like to start with you, please, ma'am, if that's okay.
Yes, ma'am, thank you. Just a few questions. One is kind of logistical. As far as if we are utilizing HB 25 days or those remote learning days, is that something that those substitute census or all that information will be taken care of at the board? Or is that something that will involve the principals at the affected schools?
Do you mean use of the remote days?
Yes, sir.
They would be done at the board level. So the superintendent, with your approval, it has to be granted. The superintendent has to make the decision to do that. We would work through the same process we do, which principals are a part of this. Just so you know, our process right now, principals report their, absences, our expected absences based on COVID data to the assistant superintendents, who meet with them to discuss those that are going to have significant issues with staffing. Then the assistant superintendents meet with us and we discuss those specific schools that might have problems. And first, obviously, we look to send central office staff to address those needs when necessary, if we can. But if it gets too much, where there's too many schools and we don't have enough personnel, that's when we make a decision for NTI. We would do the same thing with remote days. So we would have discussions with principals, but the decision would lie with me.
Okay, and I've got a couple of questions that I've been asked by parents and teachers. So if it is a remote learning day, do the teachers still report to the building?
Yes, they would. by statute. It's like NTI. They would have the only exception would be, and I'll say this just so everyone knows, we do have weather coming in later this week. If we change to an NTI weather day, it still counts as one of our 10 NTI days, but an NTI weather day allows staff to teach from home. So if we do call an NTI weather day, they're allowed to stay home. NTI COVID days, they must go to their work location.
Okay, thank you. Since it would not necessarily be going out to the entire district, if a family's school is affected by a remote learning day, what communication should they look for so that they know and are aware?
Yeah, well, that's my hesitation, as when you talk about a district with 155, to start just listing off these schools are in and these schools are out. That could be very confusing when you're, I think when you have a district of 5 or 6 schools, it's much easier to say these 2 are out and these other 4 or 5 are in. So that's a challenge for us, but that's why I would anticipate us looking more at levels so that, if we needed to say, elementary schools have a tendency to be able to go because there's less employees in the building, and so less movement amongst kids. So we can, many times say elementary and focus all of our support going to elementary schools, and then possibly middle and high would be in remote learning. That's just an example of what we could do. But our communication, we're hoping it to be more along those lines as opposed to here's 155 schools, these 75 are in and these 80 are out. That's what we really want to stay away from.
Right, and I agree with that. And then my final question is, I've had a couple of teachers ask that the COVID days that they're given, excuse me, I'm sick myself. If their school is closed, but their child's school is open, are they able to use those COVID days, or will they be required to use sick days?
Well, their school wouldn't be closed. Their school, if there would be remote instruction. And so Dr. Green-Webb, could you answer that, please?
Yes, so we would certainly review the circumstances for the teachers, depending on whether the child's school is closed or not in person, and if the teachers was in person or not. We'd have to examine those. That's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Okay, so if that happens, how much notice would they have maybe that their kid's school isn't going to be in person and they would need to make arrangements? I know that's a problem for everyone in the community, but I was specifically asked, so I thought I would pass that question on to you all.
Yeah, that's a challenge we'll have to tackle, and we'll obviously do that this week. I can't say we'll have a perfect answer for that, but that is the challenge. I've talked with other superintendents about some being in and some being out.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Moving next to board member Dr. Chris.